A lone fighter limped through the gray morning sky, trailing smoke like a wounded animal trying to outrun its own blood. The date was April 18, 1945. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, 240 miles east of Okinawa, a 20-year-old pilot named Ensign Tadayoshi Koga clung to a dying machine and a thinner hope. His Zero shuddered with every gust, the engine coughing in short, sick bursts that sounded too much like a countdown. Inside the cramped cockpit, Koga could taste metal and salt, feel the sting of oil in his eyes, and hear his own heartbeat banging louder than the engine. He did not know it yet, but within minutes he would put his plane down on the wooden deck of an American aircraft carrier, alive, unshot, and staring into the faces of the very men he had been trained to kill. No one on that ship would fire at him. No one would quite understand what they were seeing, and that impossible landing would quietly help change the air war over the Pacific just a few hours earlier. None of this had existed, only routine and repetition. The mission had begun before dawn from an airfield on Formosa. Another patrol plotted on another map pinned to another wall in a war that already felt endless. For Japanese pilots, the sky above the Pacific had turned into a coin toss. Every time the wheels left the ground, there were only two sides left to chance: come home or vanish. That morning, the coin flipped against Koga. American Hellcats dropped out of the sun like steel hawks, their guns already spitting fire. His wingman disappeared in a bloom of orange and black. 1 second, a living voice on the radio, the next, a falling lump of debris and smoke. Koga jerked his stick, felt the Zero shiver as bullets stitched through the fuselage, and dove straight into a wall of cloud. For a few long seconds, the world became nothing but gray, blur, and blind instinct. When he burst out into clear air again, the Hellcats were gone. So was everything else. Silence on the radio. No island, no coastline, no familiar pattern of reefs and waves. Just water stretching to the edge of sight. A flat, merciless blue. Koga looked down at his instruments and felt his stomach drop. Fuel bleeding away. Oil pressure falling. Compass spinning just enough to be useless. Somewhere behind him, his base lay on a bearing he no longer trusted. The Zero twitched in his hands, like a tired animal begging to be put down. He had been trained for courage, for sacrifice, for the sharp, clean death of a dive into an enemy ship. He had not been trained for this. Slow, empty, helpless, drifting toward nowhere. For a moment, alone above all that water, the war felt very far away. There was only a young man and a failing engine, and the realization that, unless he found something solid beneath him, the ocean would claim his body without even a splash anyone would remember. He saw it as a shape first, a long gray sliver. Too straight to be a wave, too broad to be a fishing boat. Then another escorting shadow. Then the thin line of a flight deck. A ship, a large one. Maybe, just maybe, a Japanese carrier group. His heart jumped once, then sank. As he descended, details sharpened into betrayal. The outline of the aircraft parked on deck was wrong. Too thick around the shoulders, too square in the wings, too foreign in silhouette. The deck markings weren't those he knew. White edges, different pattern, wrong rhythm. American, a United States Navy carrier group, lay directly beneath his crippled Zero. Turning away meant almost certain death in the ocean. Staying meant flying straight into the teeth of the enemy. There was a strange calm in realizing there was no real choice at all. He leveled his wings and lined up with the carrier's bow. Not as an attacker, but as a desperate man looking for somewhere to fall. Down below on the flight deck of the escort carrier USS Bogue, routine hummed along as usual. Ground crews moved fuel hoses, checked chocks, and waited for returning aircraft when a lookout's shout shattered the rhythm. A Zero, low damaged. The words lashed across the deck like an electric shock. Men froze, then sprinted. Alarm bells wailed. Gun crews swung their barrels upward, hands already finding triggers by long habit. A wounded Japanese fighter overhead was not a mystery. It was the first line of a familiar story called Kamikaze. Yet, something about the next few seconds did not fit the script. The aircraft did not accelerate into a final plunge. It did not roll into a diving attack. Its nose remained unnervingly steady. The landing gear hung down, extended like a white flag made of steel. It looked impossibly as if the pilot were trying to land. On the bridge, Commander Harold Dixon raised his binoculars and stared. Every page of doctrine he knew screamed that this was wrong. A suicide pilot did not lower his wheels. A strafing run did not come in this slow and level. There was no bomb slung under the fuselage, no obvious sign of a last-moment trick, just a battered Zero, bleeding smoke. With its wheels down and its nose pointed straight at his deck, men waited for the order they expected to hear. Open fire. Dixon hesitated for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, his mind working faster than the seconds allowed. If he was wrong, he risked his ship. If he was right and fired anyway, he would be ordering the cold-blooded destruction of a man who appeared to be surrendering in the only way he could. Something in the set of that plane, in the wobbling stubbornness of its approach, made his decision. His voice went sharp and hard. Hold fire. Gunners tightened jaws, loosened fingers. The carrier, built to launch and recover its own metal flock, found itself silently bracing to welcome a sworn enemy onto its back. Up in the cockpit, Koga knew none of this. All he could see was a narrow rectangle of wooden planks swelling in his windscreen. The air above the bow boiled with turbulence, sending the crippled Zero rocking from side to side. He gripped the stick tight enough to make his knuckles ache and forced his breathing slow. Below him, colored shirts scattered across the deck, some diving for cover, some frozen in place, all watching. The landing signal officer, a man trained to wave American pilots aboard with precise arm motions, stood at his post with paddles limp at his sides, mind refusing to process what his eyes were receiving. Guide him in. Wave him off. There was no procedure for this. Koga coaxed the nose a little lower, feeling the last strength draining from the engine. 50 feet. 30. 20. The propeller clawed the air in ragged spasms. The smell of hot oil thickened. At 10 feet, he gently eased back on the throttle, trying to nurse a few more seconds of lift. The engine quit. No cough, no protest, just sudden dead weight at the nose. The world lurched down and forward. Men on deck shouted. The LSO threw himself aside. Someone yelled for everyone to brace. The Zero slammed into the wooden deck with a brutal metallic crack. Bounced once, skidded sideways, its wheels screaming in protest. The tailhook skipped over one arresting wire, then another, scraping sparks. Finally catching the fourth cable with a savage jerk that nearly tore the plane in two. No explosion, no fireball, no wave of shrapnel ripping men to pieces. Just a green and gray fighter sitting crooked on the deck. Engine dead, propeller bent, smoke curling lazily from the cowling. For a moment that felt outside of time, every man on that deck simply stared. A Japanese Zero had just dactylly landed on an American carrier. Not shot down, not dragged aboard as wreckage. Landed under its own dying power, like any other bird in the flock, inside the cockpit. Tadayoshi Koga sat shaking, unsure whether to believe his own survival. The canopy glass still rattled from the impact. His hands trembled on the controls. He slowly lifted them, palms open, fingers spread, the universal language of surrender that did not require any shared words. A ring of sailors formed around the plane, rifles raised but not yet aimed. Faces caught halfway between fear and astonished curiosity. Close up, the legendary enemy pilot did not look like a demon from propaganda posters. He looked like a tired boy with oil streaked across his cheek and blood, trickling from a cut on his brow. One of the nearest sailors, barely older than Koga, muttered under his breath that the enemy was just a kid. The thought passed from face to face without needing to be spoken aloud. These were the men they'd been told never took prisoners and never asked for mercy. Yet here he was, hands in the air, trapped inside his cockpit, clearly as frightened as any of them. Commander Dixon walked forward, boots thumping on wood, and stopped a few feet from the nose of the Zero. For a long moment, he and the young pilot simply regarded one another, separated by canopy glass, language, and the entire Pacific Ocean of war. Dixon finally spoke in a firm, even voice. Knowing the words themselves might not be understood, but the tone would be, "You'll be treated fairly. Don't make any sudden moves." Koga could not catch every syllable, but he heard no rage, no triumph, only control. He nodded once, slowly. The canopy creaked open. Cool sea air rushed into the cramped cockpit, and with it, the realization that standing up meant stepping into the hands of his enemies. He hesitated, then swung one leg out. The moment his boots touched the deck, his knees buckled. Two sailors moved faster than their fear, catching him by the arms before he could hit the boards. The contact was small, awkward, but it snapped something in the air. The terrifying shape that had fallen out of the sky was no longer an abstract enemy machine. It was a young man so exhausted he couldn't even stand. They led him away under guard, weaving through parked aircraft and coils of rope. Koga's eyes, trained to memorize airfields and flight patterns, could not help drinking in what he saw. Planes arranged in neat, efficient rows, fuel and ammunition moving like clockwork under the direction of hand signals and shouted codes. The carrier did not feel like the fragile, improvised world of the island bases he knew. It felt like an entire city compressed into steel, humming with purpose and abundance. In spite of himself, he felt a flicker of awe that gnawed quietly at the core of everything he'd been taught about enemy weakness. Down below decks, in a small compartment that smelled of metal and disinfectant, Koga sat on a bench with his head bowed, waiting for the pain he had been promised his whole life would follow capture. He imagined fists, boots, shouted questions he could not answer, humiliation layered on top of shame. Instead, the door opened and a medic stepped in with a calm expression and a battered canvas kit. The man spoke in a language Koga barely understood, but his hands were gentle. He dabbed the cut on Koga's forehead with stinging antiseptic, wrapped a small bandage, and handed him a tin cup of water. When Koga hesitated, the medic simply nodded, an invitation instead of a command. The water was cool, clean, startling after months of rationed canteens. It slid down his throat like proof that something in the world did not match the stories he'd been fed. While Koga tried to reconcile that kindness with years of drilled hatred, the deck above him had become a different kind of battlefield. Officers, engineers, and intelligence men swarmed around the captured Zero. For years, American pilots had faced this aircraft with a mix of respect and fear. It climbed faster, turned tighter, and seemed always to be where it needed to be. Now, for the first time, a fully intact flyable example sat on one of their own decks, like an unexpected gift. Men ran hands along its skin, surprised at how thin the metal felt, more like a soda tin than armor. They peered into the cockpit, noting the absence of protective plates, the exposed fuel lines, the relentless pursuit of weight savings at the cost of a pilot's safety. To a mechanic who had watched friends die in dogfights with these machines, it looked like a death trap with wings. To the officers responsible for future battles, it looked like an open book. Every cable and rivet promised answers to questions that had haunted briefings since Pearl Harbor. How far could it roll before stalling? How did it handle dives? Where did its performance fall apart? Those answers might mean the difference between coming home and not, for hundreds of American airmen who had not yet flown their last. Missions dot in his compartment, Koga could feel faint vibrations through the bulkhead as tools met metal above. He knew without seeing that his aircraft was being dismantled, not as wreckage, but as revelation. The thought felt like acid on his sense of duty, that Zero had been more than a machine. It was the cutting edge of the air arm his country had believed would win the skies. Now every secret shape of its wings and angle of its control surfaces would be measured, tested, turned into tactics used against his comrades. It should have died with him in the sea. Instead, it was alive in enemy hands because he had chosen not to die. Hours later, the door opened again. Two Marines motioned for him to stand. Their faces gave away nothing, but their grips were firm without being cruel. They walked him through narrow passageways that thrummed with distant engine noise and the everyday life of the ship. Voices drifted past in snatches. Laughter here, a sharp order there, the clatter of tools, the faint clang of something heavy being moved. The carrier felt impossibly large, a world with its own weather and gravity. Eventually, they ushered him into a small room where a handful of officers waited. Along with a Japanese-speaking interpreter, Koga kept his eyes on the floor, trying to brace his mind against the next chapter. The interpreter addressed him by rank and name gently, almost respectfully. They wanted to ask about his condition, his unit, the events of that morning. Not about codes or plans or targets, at least not yet. Koga answered in short, halting phrases. Each word weighed against what he owed his homeland and what little he could offer without betraying it. When he murmured that capture meant shame, the senior officer across the table studied him for a moment and replied that choosing to live was not dishonor, just a different kind of courage. The words struck him in a place war had not yet reached. For years he had been told there was only one honorable end. Now the enemy themselves were telling him that breathing was not a crime. The questioning did not last long. No blows fell. No threats were hissed through clenched teeth. When it ended, the Marines took him back to his compartment, where someone had quietly left a tray of food richer than anything he had seen in months. Rice, meat, bread, water that did not taste faintly of rust. He ate slowly at first, then with a hunger that betrayed him. Each bite loosened the knot of terror in his chest by a fraction, but it did nothing to lighten the weight of what his survival might cost. Up above, as the day faded into a soft Pacific dusk, the Zero was secured for transfer. Once the ship reached port, it would be shipped on, tested, flown by American pilots who would learn how to beat it systematically. In later months, new tactics would spread across briefing rooms. Don't turn with it. Dive instead. Exploit its fragile construction. Use its blind spots. Somewhere in that chain of cause and effect would lie the unmarked origin. A single, desperate landing by a young man who did not want to die over empty water. That night, lying on a narrow bunk that did not rock as violently as his mind, Koga stared at the dim ceiling and tried to imagine what his family had been told, what his commanders would think. What word they would use for him now? Traitor, coward, failure, or nothing at all. His name simply crossed off a list and buried under euphemism. He pressed his palm against the thin wall, feeling the faint, distant throbbing of engines pushing the carrier forward. He had become, unwillingly, part of the enemy's story now. Their prisoner, their witness, their unexpected advantage. Yet beneath the layers of shame and confusion, a stubborn thread of something else remained. He was alive. That simple fact cut through the noise in rare, quiet moments. He had seen kindness in the hands that bandaged his wound. He had seen awe, not hatred, in the eyes that first circled his crashed fighter. He had heard an enemy officer tell him that survival itself carried its own kind of dignity. The war outside would continue to grind men into statistics. Planes would still blaze and fall. Islands would still be fought for inch by inch. But somewhere in the long, tangled story of that conflict, there would always be this strange, improbable chapter. The morning when a Japanese Zero dropped out of the sky onto an American carrier, and everyone on that ship hesitated. Just long enough to choose curiosity over reflex. Long after the guns fell silent and the maps were redrawn, historians would look back and point to the captured Zero as a small hinge on which larger events had turned. Pilots, briefed on its weaknesses, would survive encounters that might once have killed them. Battles would tilt differently by margins too thin to see in the moment. Koga himself would never fully grasp how far the ripple of his desperate decision traveled. To him, it remained a memory stitched together from fragments. The glow of warning lights on his panel, the shock of seeing that alien deck rise to meet him, the jolt of touchdown, the ring of faces around his canopy, the strange, dissonant gentleness of the hands that pulled him free. In the end, his story was not one of triumph in the usual sense. He did not win a glorious dogfight or score a famous victory. He lost his aircraft, his mission, perhaps his place in the pantheon of heroes, his homeland celebrated. What he preserved instead was something quieter and in some ways more stubborn, the thin line connecting one breath to the next. In keeping that line unbroken, he inadvertently handed his enemies a powerful gift and forced both sides for a moment to look directly at the human being sitting alone inside the silhouette they had spent years learning to hate